Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a pretty fundamental question. How has our understanding of men's role in reproduction changed over time? We've got a really interesting collection of historical accounts and studies to dig into, and it's honestly kind of surprising to see how this whole concept has evolved from ancient beliefs to the science we know today.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, back in the day, before anyone really knew what was going on, the whole thing must have seemed like a total mystery. I mean, think about it. There's this gap between, well, intercourse and then actually seeing a baby. Plus, all the really important stuff is happening inside the woman's body, hidden away.
Totally. It's like, how could they have known? Okay, so let's go way back, like ancient Egypt and the Near East. What really jumps out is how much they focused on male sexuality as this, like, primary creative force. It's all over their mythology.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's all phalluses and fluids. Like the Egyptian god Adam, he creates the world through, well, ejaculation. That's a pretty potent image, right? And then you've got gods like Amun and Osiris always shown with these exaggerated, well, features. It's like they were projecting their own social structure with men on top onto the very act of creation.
Right. And it's not just Egypt. We see the same kind of thing in Mesopotamia. Enki, their god, his fluids, were thought to create rivers and life. Even the Hebrew Bible hints at this male agency in creation. It's wild. Like, if there wasn't a male fertility god around, people thought that meant infertility?
Exactly. Now, skip ahead to ancient Greece. They start to shift a bit, recognizing that both parents actually contribute this idea of dual contribution. And it's based on something pretty obvious. Kids often look like both their mom and dad.
Duh, right? But Greek society was still patriarchal. And then you have this whole thing with pederasty, which makes you wonder about how they really viewed men's roles beyond just fatherhood. Then there's Rome, where they did this weird thing of like mapping male anatomy onto women's bodies.
Yeah, they saw ovaries as women's testicles and the uterus as like a deflated scrotum. It's bizarre. They even thought women had weak sperma that needed, well, the good stuff from men to really work. It all kind of reinforces this idea that women were just inferior versions of men.
Wow. So over in ancient China, having sons was a really big deal for family lines and taking care of older folks. The idea that men were superior was like baked into their culture.
And since farming was seen as men's work, having sons to help out just made sense. They had this concept of huanjing bunao, where semen, or jing, was thought of as this vital energy. They even used herbs to try and boost male fertility.
Interesting. It seems like they were very aware of the male role in all of this, not just the baby-making part. Ancient India was similar, right? The male child, the Dharmaputra, was super important for religious rituals. Semen, they called it sukra, or varia, was considered this precious life force.
Right, and they had practices like brahmacharya focused on conserving semen. The lingam, a symbol of Shiva's power, also emphasized male generative power, and even Niyoga, which allowed a widow to have a kid with her brother-in-law if her husband couldn't, shows how important it was to continue the family line through a male. It's like they acknowledged male infertility but found a workaround to prioritize the male lineage.
So while all this cultural stuff was happening, in ancient Greece, some philosophers started asking deeper questions. How does this all actually work?
Yeah, you had Parmenides and Empedocles with their two-seed theories, and then Anaxagoras saying it was just one seed, with the man providing the active ingredient and the woman being more like a vessel. They were starting to get at the biological mechanisms.
Right, like looking for a physical explanation. Empedocles even suggested that different seeds made different parts of the baby. Then comes Aristotle. He recognized both sexes contributed, although let's be honest, he had some pretty sexist views too.
Yeah, his analogy of the carpenter is interesting. Semen provided the form, like a blueprint, and the women supplied the material, but he also called women mutilated males, which just shows how ingrained these ideas were.
Okay, so fast forward to the scientific revolution. In 1677, Leeuwenhoek and Ham discover sperm, these tiny animalcules swimming around. At first, people thought they contained tiny preformed humans, homunculi, just waiting to grow. Wild, right?
It is pretty out there. But then Spallanzani comes along with his experiments. He showed that sperm were actually essential for development, not just some parasite hanging out. This was a major breakthrough.
Definitely. Then in the 19th century, von Baer observes the mammalian ovum, the egg. And in 1876, Hertwig finally proves that fertilization happens when the egg and sperm fuse. So it really does take two.
Exactly. And around the same time, we started to understand spermatogenesis, how sperm are made, and the roles of these cells in the testes called Leydig and Sertoli cells, which produce sperm and hormones. Huge for understanding the male biological role. By the mid-20th century, we're using semen analysis to figure out male fertility issues.
And then IVF comes along in 1978, followed by ICSI in 1992. These technologies really cemented the active role of sperm in fertilization. It wasn't just about providing the blueprint anymore. The sperm had to get in there and do the work. But anthropology reminds us that it's not just about biology, right?
Right. Culture plays a huge role. Different societies have different ideas about what men are supposed to do in all this. And then there are things like STIs, which men can transmit, and their positions of power in society, which all influence reproductive health. It's interesting how men were historically left out of maternal and child health programs, but now there's a push to recognize their reproductive rights, too.
It's true, fatherhood looks different all over the world. And it's also fascinating how tied up procreation is with masculinity and how infertility can really affect a man's sense of self. In some cultures, men are starting to want to be more involved in conversations about having kids, which is a shift. If we look back at agriculture and animal husbandry, we see that people have recognized the male animal's role in breeding for a long time, even without fully understanding the science.
Think about the early use of artificial insemination in horses. People knew what was up. Animal studies also played a big part in early research on hormones and male reproductive health.
And then there's the whole legal and social side of things, paternity and inheritance. You can really see how the understanding of the male role has shaped our laws and social structures. The historical disadvantages faced by kids born outside of marriage are a prime example.
Yeah, and those laws varied a lot between places. It's interesting to see how the focus has shifted over time, with a greater emphasis on shared parental responsibility and the use of DNA testing to determine paternity.
And of course, we can't forget about the social and gender dynamics at play. Feminist perspectives, for example, have been crucial in challenging the old view of women as passive vessels and highlighting how patriarchal power has shaped our understanding of reproductive roles.
Absolutely. They've really pushed for a more nuanced understanding of men's roles, going beyond just the biological. It's not just about sperm, it's about the whole social context.
Right. Even after scientists figured out fertilization in the late 19th century, gender biases stuck around. Even textbooks often showed the sperm as this active, conquering hero, and the egg as this passive thing just waiting around.
It shows how these cultural ideas can persist even when the science contradicts them. It's interesting to see the shift in recent decades, with more policy focus on men's role in fertility and fatherhood.
So, wow, it's been a long and winding road, hasn't it? From ancient myths about men being the sole creators to our modern understanding of the equal but distinct roles of sperm and egg.
And we're still learning and evolving. The cultural and social aspects are just as important as the biological, and they all interact in complex ways.
It makes you wonder, what other things that we take for granted about biology and society might be due for a similar reevaluation? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.